In the spring of 1943, as the world's attention was fixed on the epic struggles in North Africa and the Eastern Front, a small force of American soldiers was sent to fight a forgotten battle on the edge of the world. Their mission was to retake the first piece of American soil that had been captured by a foreign enemy since the War of 1812. Their target was Attu, a tiny, desolate island at the far western end of Alaska's Aleutian chain. The soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division, many of them trained in the sunny deserts of California, were told it would be a quick 3-day operation. They were completely unprepared for the reality that awaited them. They were not just going to fight the Japanese. They were going to fight the island itself. Attu was not a tropical paradise. It was a barren, treeless landscape of volcanic mountains, frozen tundra, and perpetual fog. It was a place of hurricane-force winds called WWII that could pick a man up and throw him, and a cold, wet misery that seeped into the bones and never left. The American soldiers, sent into this Arctic nightmare in standard-issue leather boots and uniforms, would soon discover that their greatest enemy was not the Japanese soldier, but the frozen hell of Attu itself. This is the hidden story of America's forgotten battle, a brutal campaign where more men were put out of action by the cold than by enemy bullets. It's a tale of catastrophic logistical failure, incredible human endurance, and a terrifying preview of the fanatical, no-surrender mentality that would define the war in the Pacific. The story begins a year earlier, in June 1942. As a diversion for their main attack on Midway, the Japanese had invaded and occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska in the Aleutians. While the diversion failed, the occupation of American territory was a massive psychological blow to the United States. For a year, the Japanese flag flew over American soil. By 1943, expelling the invaders had become a matter of national honor. The U.S. military planned Operation Landcrab, an amphibious assault to retake Attu. The 7th Infantry Division was chosen for the task. They were a solid division, but they had been training for desert warfare in California. In a baffling and ultimately tragic failure of planning, they were shipped to the Aleutians with the same gear. They had no proper Arctic clothing, no waterproof boots, and inadequate tents and sleeping bags. They were being sent to fight a winter war in summer uniforms. The Japanese force on Attu was small, only about 2,600 men, commanded by Colonel Yasuo Yamasaki. But they were tough, experienced soldiers, and they had spent a year turning the mountainous island into a fortress. They had dug a complex system of trenches and foxholes into the frozen slopes of the mountains overlooking the landing beaches. They knew they were outnumbered and could not win. Their mission was not to defeat the Americans, but to hold out as long as possible and inflict the maximum number of casualties. The American invasion began on May 11, 1943. From the start, everything went wrong. A dense, cold fog, typical of the Aleutians, shrouded the island. The naval bombardment was largely ineffective, as the gunners couldn't see their targets. The landing craft, struggling through rough seas and fog, landed on the wrong beaches. But the initial landings were unopposed. The Americans got ashore and saw nothing. The island seemed deserted. They began to move inland, confident that the Japanese had fled. It was a trap. Colonel Yamasaki had deliberately left the beaches undefended. He had pulled all of his men back into the high ground, into the fog-shrouded mountain passes and ridges. He was going to let the Americans come to him, into the terrain where he held every advantage. As the American soldiers began their advance, they entered a world of pure misery. The ground was a spongy, frozen muskeg, a kind of Arctic tundra. With every step, they would sink up to their knees in icy water and mud. Their standard-issue leather boots became waterlogged in minutes and then froze, leading to immediate and severe cases of trench foot and frostbite. The weather was a relentless enemy. The infamous Aleutian willywaws would scream down from the mountains without warning, bringing with them horizontal sleet and snow. The fog was so thick that visibility was often reduced to just a few feet. Men got lost just yards from their own lines. Units became separated. The radios, not properly waterproofed, failed in the constant dampness. And then the Japanese opened fire. From their hidden positions in the mountains above, Japanese machine gunners and snipers began to pick off the struggling American soldiers. The Americans were completely exposed on the open tundra, while the Japanese were dug into camouflaged positions they had spent a year preparing. The fighting became a slow, brutal crawl up the mountains. The Americans had to attack uphill, against an entrenched enemy they could rarely see. A single, well-placed machine gun nest could hold up an entire battalion for hours. Casualties mounted, but not just from bullets. The cold was the great killer. Soldiers, unable to stay dry, quickly succumbed to hypothermia. The wounded who could not be evacuated immediately would often freeze to death where they lay. Trench foot was rampant. Men's feet would swell, turn black, and become gangrenous. For hundreds of soldiers, the battle for Attu ended not with a bullet, but with an amputation. The casualty figures tell a horrifying story. Of the roughly 15,000 Americans who fought on Attu, over 3,900 became casualties. But of those, only about 550 were killed in action. Over 1,200 were wounded, but a staggering 2,100 were put out of action by the cold alone, frostbite, trench foot, and disease. The environment was a more effective enemy than the Japanese. The logistical situation was a disaster. Supplies landed on the beaches but could not be moved forward to the men on the front lines. There were no roads, and the tracked vehicles the Americans brought could not handle the muskeg. For days, the soldiers at the front had no hot food, no dry clothes, and were running low on ammunition. The only way to get supplies to them was by teams of men carrying them on their backs. A slow and perilous journey through the mud and fog. The suffering was immense. A soldier from the 7th Division later wrote, "I have seen hell. It is a place called Attu. We lived in water-filled foxholes, we ate frozen K rations, and our feet were never dry. I remember taking off my boot one day and a chunk of my heel came off with the sock. We were not fighting a war. We were just trying to survive." But despite the incredible hardship, the American soldiers pressed on. They were fighting with a courage born of pure grit and determination. They learned to use the fog to their advantage, crawling up the mountain slopes to get close to the Japanese positions before launching their assaults. The fighting was intimate and brutal, often decided with grenades and bayonets at close quarters. Slowly, day by agonizing day, they pushed the Japanese defenders back, from one mountain pass to the next. By late May, after nearly 2 weeks of savage fighting, the remaining Japanese forces, now numbering less than 1,000 men, were cornered in the area around Chichagof Harbor. Their commander, Colonel Yamasaki, knew the end was near, but he was not going to surrender. He was a follower of the Bushido Code, the way of the warrior, which held that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. On May 28, he sent his final message to his superiors. He reported that he was preparing for a final glorious attack. His final words were, "I will attack the enemy. I will die a glorious death and receive the eternal joys of a patriot." He then gathered his remaining men, including the wounded who could still walk. He gave them their final orders. They would not surrender. They would not be taken prisoner. They would launch one last, massive banzai charge and die in battle. Any soldier too wounded to participate in the charge was to be given a grenade to commit suicide. On the night of May 29th, the unthinkable happened. Under the cover of fog and darkness, Colonel Yamasaki led his remaining force, about 800 men, in a desperate suicidal charge. They swarmed out of their mountain positions and charged directly into the American lines. The American soldiers, caught by surprise, were initially overrun. The Japanese, screaming banzai, fought with a fanatical fury. They used their bayonets, swords, and even their bare hands. They broke through the American front line and continued their charge deep into the rear areas. They overran a command post and even a field hospital, where they killed wounded American soldiers in their beds. The charge was only stopped by a desperate, last-ditch defense thrown up by American engineers, medics, and service troops, who grabbed whatever weapons they could find and fought for their lives. The fighting lasted all night, a chaotic and terrifying melee in the fog. When the sun rose on May 30th, the battle was over. The ground was littered with the bodies of the Japanese soldiers. They had fought until almost every single man was killed. Many of the last survivors had held grenades to their chests and pulled the pins rather than be captured. Colonel Yamasaki himself was among the dead. Of the entire Japanese garrison of roughly 2,600 men, only 28 were taken prisoner, and all of them were too wounded to resist. The Battle of Attu was over. The island had been retaken, but the victory felt hollow. The Americans had won, but at a terrible cost, and what they had witnessed in that final banzai charge had shaken them to their core. This was something new. These were not the rules of Western warfare. This was a fanatical, suicidal devotion that they did not understand. It was a terrifying preview of what they would face on a much larger scale in the years to come, on islands like Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The story of the Battle of Attu was quickly buried by the larger events of the war. It was a sideshow, a forgotten battle fought in a frozen hell at the edge of the world. But for the men who fought there, it was the defining experience of their lives. They had survived not just a determined enemy, but one of the most hostile environments on Earth. They had been let down by poor planning and inadequate equipment, but they had not been broken. They had endured, and in doing so, they had shown the world the incredible resilience of the American soldier. The frozen, fog-shrouded mountains of Attu were the first place where Americans learned the true, brutal nature of the war in the Pacific. It was a lesson they would never forget.